Hi all, welcome to the A-Level Law Essay channel again. In this episode, the essay is going to be covering the chapter Criminal Process and the fundamental human rights to the grant of bail. Before we begin, please subscribe to my channel for more video guides on essay writing and many other interesting topics. With that said, let's get started with part 1 of video guide number 8. Question. Today's question reads, bail is a fundamental human right that should be granted to suspected offenders no matter the crime. Critically consider if the criteria and practice used by the police and the courts in granting or refusing bail are in line with the fundamental human right to personal liberty. From the question, we can infer that it covers the chapter Criminal Process, but more specifically, the topic on bail. And the focus of the question asks us to consider whether the criteria used by the police and the courts in granting or refusing bail are in line with the fundamental human right to personal liberty. Introduction. Before we start, it is important to note that bail isn't a stand-alone chapter or topic as it relates to criminal process, or in other words, it involves police powers. Therefore, in our introduction, we should briefly mention the police and its powers, especially with regards to the powers of arrest, detention and subsequent charging of the suspect with a crime, and how it then comes to the question on bail. After that, we can briefly define bail and its importance as human right to civil liberty. That being said, it should be noted that this essay has a slight overlap with the chapter Human Rights, especially with regards to Article 5 of the European Convention of Human Rights. In the thesis statement, we should emphasize that before we go on to evaluate if the criteria used by the police and the courts in granting or refusing bail are in line with the fundamental human right to personal liberty, we should first discuss in detail the definition and importance of bail and the criminal process which led to the question of bail. Point 1. Again, as a bridging point and to develop our answer properly, we should first briefly discuss some of the relevant police powers with an example of a scenario which will lead to the relevance and discussion on bail. This essentially means that we will briefly explain arrest, detention and the eventual criminal charge to the suspect for whatever offense. After that, we go on to define bail and briefly discuss its importance to the suspect who has been charged with a crime and how both the police and the magistrate's court have the authority to decide on bail. This is where we can explain how bail generally works. The discussion on bail should not go without the mention of the Bail Act 1976 and Article 5 of the European Convention of Human Rights. As this is but the development stage of the essay, we should definitely not give out too much detail or thoughts about the Act and the article. We should save most of the critical discussion when we address the question at the evaluation point. Therefore, in point 1, it should mostly be factual-based discussion on the very nature and importance of bail. Point 2. After discussing the nature and importance of bail, we can now move on to discuss the many criteria for which bail can or cannot be granted. Here, the conditions for bail under the Bail Act 1976 should be discussed in detail with simple examples to illustrate how some of the conditions can be applied to a given scenario. This is especially with regards to factors such as the nature and seriousness of an offense, the strength of the evidence against the suspect, and so on. The criteria against bail for repeated indictable crimes such as murder, rape, and so on under the Criminal Justice and Public Order Act 1994 should also be mentioned. Apart from that, we can also briefly mention the appeals for bail by the defendants and the appeals against bail by the prosecution. In this point, we should definitely not discuss the criteria for bail against the idea of fundamental liberties, as we should leave that for the evaluation point. Point 3. Here, we should endeavor to critically evaluate bail and the conditions for bail against the notion of fundamental human right to personal liberty. What this means is that we should now emphasize more on human rights to liberty And with this, we should definitely bring up Article 5 of the European Convention of Human Rights as well as the Human Rights Act 1998. However, it should be noted that whatever we discuss about human rights should be related to bail and the conditions of bail so that critical evaluation can be made about the justice for and against the grant of bail. With this in mind, we should definitely bring up some of the more critical aspects for the criteria for and against the granting of bail. Some of these aspects can include the suspect's criminal record and previous grants of bail, whether for a minor crime or an indictable one. This point also allows us more freedom to express ourselves so that whilst addressing the question, we can give our own comments, views and opinions on the matter so that we can give more life to our essay and make it stand out as an A-grade answer. However, it should also be noted that our own comments, views and opinions should only come after all the factual discussions have been made so that the essay is properly developed. Conclusion. As always, a simple conclusion will do. We should definitely not insert any more new points into our conclusion, otherwise it wouldn't be a conclusion. Just briefly summarize what has been discussed in the content of the essay and highlight some of the more important points of the essay that may address the question. Review. Before we end, let's have a quick review on the content guide. In the introduction, we briefly mentioned police powers and how it relates to bail, and then briefly defined bail and its human rights background before we moved on to the thesis statement stating our objective for the whole essay. In point 1, we develop our essay by bridging the gap between the introduction and the focus of the content by briefly explaining how bail generally works in a factual-based discussion on the very nature and importance of bail. In point 2, we endeavor to discuss the many conditions and criteria for and against the granting of bail in any given scenario. In point 3, we critically evaluated the conditions and criteria for bail by bringing up the notion of fundamental human right to personal liberty and gave our own views, comments, and opinions about it. We concluded it by summing up our discussion and highlighting some of the more important points in the whole content of the answer. That is the end of the content guide for this video tutorial. If you have any questions or opinions on my approach to answering the question, please do comment below. Do check out part 2 of this video tutorial where I will go through with you a sample essay on this question. I will put a link to it in the description below. If you find this video tutorial useful, please like, share and subscribe to my channel for more.